The first bullet shattered the medical tent support pole at 0347 hours, sending canvas rippling like a dying breath across the makeshift field hospital. Navy Hospital Corpsman Second Class Elena Rodriguez didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady as she sutured the entry wound on Marine Lance Corporal Davies' shoulder, the needle catching moonlight that filtered through the sudden tear in their shelter. Around them, the forward operating base erupted into controlled chaos, boots pounding against packed earth, voices cutting through the darkness with practiced urgency, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Contact North. Contact North. The radio crackled from the command tent 50 meters away. Multiple hostiles, estimated 20, engaging friendly forces at Checkpoint Alpha. Elena's fingers moved with surgical precision, each stitch a small act of defiance against the violence trying to claim Davies' life. The 19-year-old from Oklahoma had taken shrapnel from an improvised explosive device during a routine patrol. Now, as enemy fire began raking across their compound in Afghanistan's Helmand province, she was the only thing standing between him and a medical evacuation. That might never come. "Doc, we gotta move," whispered Petty Officer Marcus Chen, her closest friend and fellow corpsman. He crouched beside the stretcher, his usually calm demeanor betrayed by the tremor in his voice. Chen had been with her through 8 months of this deployment, had seen her work miracles with nothing but gauze and determination, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of finality that veteran medics learned to recognize in the set of wounded shoulders. The particular silence that fell between mortar rounds. Elena ignored him, focusing instead on the intricate dance her hands performed in the dim red light of their battery-powered surgical lamp. Davies' breathing had steadied, but his pulse remained thready beneath her fingertips. She could feel the heat of his fever through her latex gloves, could smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with the dusty ancient scent of Afghan soil that permeated everything in this forgotten corner of the world. Bafab had been their home for 3 months now, a collection of reinforced tents and concrete barriers nestled in a valley that had seen warfare for centuries. The locals called it Jahannam Hell, and Elena was beginning to understand why. Every morning brought new casualties from patrol routes that seemed to shift like quicksand. Every evening brought reports of increased enemy activity, of a Taliban cell that had made this region their personal hunting ground. But Elena had also seen something else in these mountains. She'd seen Sergeant Maria Santos, a logistics specialist from Puerto Rico, distributing candy to Afghan children who gathered at the base perimeter. She'd watched Staff Sergeant James Morrison, a gruff infantry veteran from Montana, spend his off-duty hours teaching English to their Afghan interpreter. Ahmad, she'd witnessed Private Rebecca Stone, barely 21 and fresh from basic training, carefully tend to a stray dog that had wandered into their compound, nursing it back to health despite regulations that prohibited pets. These small acts of humanity had become Elena's anchor in a place where hope seemed as scarce as clean water. They reminded her why she'd chosen medicine over the combat roles. Her physical scores and tactical aptitude had qualified her for. Every life saved was a victory against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Another bullet punched through the tent wall, this one closer, sending a spray of sand across her workspace. Davies' eyes fluttered open, pupils dilated from the morphine she'd administered earlier. "Doc," he whispered, his voice carrying the accent of endless Oklahoma plains. "What's happening?" "Just some noise, Marines being Marines," Elena replied, forcing her voice to remain steady as she completed the final suture. Her hands never paused, never betrayed the fact that her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "You're going to be fine, Davies. This is good work, textbook even. You'll be back home telling stories about your Afghan vacation before you know it." Davies managed a weak smile, and Elena felt that familiar warmth that came with successful treatment. It was a feeling she'd first experienced during her training at the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, Virginia. She'd been 22 then, fresh from a biology degree at University of Texas at San Antonio, driven by memories of her grandfather's stories from Vietnam. Abuelo Rodriguez had been a medic too, had carried wounded Marines through rice paddies while bullets sang overhead. He'd died when Elena was 15, but not before teaching her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to act, despite being terrified. The tent shuddered as another explosion echoed across the valley, this one close enough to rattle their equipment. Chun grabbed the radio from his belt, his face grim in the red light. Corpsman 1 to command, requesting immediate Pacific for 1 wounded, ready for transport. Negative, Corpsman 1. The voice belonged to Captain Williams, their commanding officer. All birds grounded due to enemy activity. Stand by for further instructions. Elena felt her stomach drop. Without helicopter evacuation, Davies would have to wait for ground transport, if it came at all. The road between their FOB and the main base was a death trap on good days, lined with hidden bombs and ambush points that had claimed too many lives already. Tonight, with active enemy contact, it might as well have been a journey to the moon. But as she looked down at Davies' face, seeing trust and vulnerability in his young eyes, Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wouldn't let him die here. She wouldn't let any of them die if she could help it. Chun, help me move him to the bunker, she ordered, her voice carrying new authority. And gather all our medical supplies. Something tells me we're going to need them. As they lifted Davies' stretcher, Elena caught sight of movement outside the tent. Through the tear in the canvas, she glimpsed figures in desert camouflage moving with predatory precision through the compound. But these weren't their Marines. These were the enemy, closer than they should have been. Inside their perimeter, the night was about to become much longer than any of them had planned. The bunker was a reinforced concrete structure built into the hillside, designed to withstand mortar attacks and small arms fire. It had been their refuge during the worst bombardments, a place where wounded soldiers could be treated while the world exploded around them. Tonight, it would become Elena's operating theater. As Chun helped her carry Davies inside, Elena's mind raced through possible scenarios. The bunker could hold perhaps 20 people comfortably, but she suspected they'd need every inch of space before dawn. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows on the walls, and the air inside tasted of concrete, dust and fear. "Doc, what's the plan?" Chun asked as they settled Davies on one of the built-in benches that lined the walls. His voice carried forced calm, but Elena could see the worry in his dark eyes. They'd trained together, studied together, shared countless quiet moments during the eternal boredom that punctuated military life. She knew he trusted her judgment, even when that judgment led them into situations their training manuals had never covered. Before Elena could answer, the bunker door burst open, admitting a stream of Marines and soldiers seeking shelter. Staff Sergeant Morrison came first, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood soaking through his uniform. Behind him stumbled Private Stone, supporting another Marine Elena didn't recognize, a young man whose face had gone gray with shock and blood loss. "Jesus Christ," Morrison gasped as Elena immediately moved to assess his wound. "They came out of nowhere, Doc. Must have been watching us for days, learning our routines. They knew exactly where to hit us." Elena's hands found the source of Morrison's bleeding, a through-and-through gunshot wound in his bicep that had missed the major arteries by millimeters. Lucky, but still serious. As she worked to control the bleeding, more wounded began filing into the bunker. Sergeant Santos appeared with a head wound that painted her face crimson but seemed superficial. 2 Marines from the perimeter carried a third between them, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Within minutes, the bunker had transformed into a scene from a combat painting, wounded soldiers arranged on makeshift beds, Elena and Chun moving Between them, with practiced efficiency, their hands stained red despite their efforts to maintain sterility. The sounds of battle outside seemed muted here, reduced to a distant thunder that punctuated their work. "Chun, I need you to start in 4 on Davies," Elena called over the noise. "His blood pressure's dropping. And someone find me more gauze. We're going through our supplies too fast." As she spoke, Elena noticed something that made her blood freeze. Through the bunker's single small window, she could see muzzle flashes much closer than they should have been. The enemy wasn't just attacking. Their perimeter, they were inside the compound, moving systematically through their defensive positions. It was then that she heard the voice that would haunt her dreams for years to come. "American medics," the voice called in accented English from somewhere outside the bunker. "We know you are there. Send out your wounded, and we will show mercy." Elena met Chun's eyes across the crowded space. They both knew what that promise was worth. In this war, mercy was a luxury neither side could afford. But as she looked at the faces of the wounded men and women under her care, Davies with his trusting smile, Morrison with his stubborn determination, Santos with her quiet strength, Elena felt something crystallize in her chest. A resolve that went beyond training, beyond duty, beyond anything she'd ever felt before. These were her people, her responsibility, and she would not let them die. The question that would define everything that followed was simple. How far was she willing to go to keep that promise? Outside the bunker, the sounds of combat were intensifying. Elena could distinguish between the sharp crack of M4 carbines and the deeper boom of enemy AK-47s, could identify the whistle of incoming mortar and the answering thunder of their defensive positions returning fire. But underneath it all, she heard something else, the screams of more wounded Americans calling for help in the darkness. "Doc, we've got to do something," Morrison said through gritted teeth as Elena finished bandaging his arm. Despite his wound, the staff sergeant's eyes remained sharp, calculating. "There are Marines out there who need help, and if we stay locked in here, they're going to bleed out." Elena knew he was right. Military doctrine called for medics to remain in secure positions during active combat, to wait for the shooting, to stop before venturing out to treat casualties. It was logical, sensible, designed to prevent medics from becoming casualties themselves. But logic felt like a cold comfort when she could hear PFC Martinez somewhere outside, crying for his mother in both English and Spanish. She moved to the bunker's reinforced door, pressing her ear against the metal. Beyond the immediate sounds of battle, she could hear something else, movement, deliberate and coordinated. The enemy wasn't just conducting a random attack. They were searching for something specific, moving with purpose through their compound. "They're looking for intelligence," she whispered to Chun, who had appeared beside her. "Documents, computers, anything that might give them information about our operations." Chun nodded grimly, "Which means they'll be busy for a while. If we're going to move, it has to be now." Elena felt the weight of decision settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to keep her existing patients stable until help arrived. But help wasn't coming, at least not soon enough. And with every passing minute, more Marines were dying in the darkness outside. She turned, addressed the crowded bunker, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos outside. "Listen up, everyone. I'm going out there to bring back our people. Chun will stay here to monitor your conditions and continue treatment. Morrison, despite your wound, you're the senior NCO present. This is your bunker now." The staff sergeant started to protest, but Elena cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "That's an order, Sergeant. These people need leadership, and you're it." As she gathered her medical pack trauma supplies, morphine, bandages, everything she could carry, Elena felt a strange calm descending over her. It was the same feeling she'd experienced during her most challenging surgeries, when everything slowed down, and her training took over completely. Fear was still there, but it was manageable now, channeled into razor-sharp focus. "Doc," Davies called weakly from his stretcher. Despite his pain medication, his eyes were clear and determined. "Bring them home." Elena nodded once, then stepped into the hell that waited outside. The compound that had been Elena's home for 3 months was now unrecognizable in the flickering light of fires and muzzle flashes. What had once been orderly rows of tents and defensive positions now resembled a war-torn nightmare, with debris scattered across the paths she'd walked hundreds of times. The familiar became foreign, transformed by violence into an alien landscape where every shadow might conceal death. Elena moved through this chaos with methodical precision, following a mental map she'd constructed during countless early morning runs around the perimeter. Her daily routine had included these runs, usually at 0500 before the Afghan sun made exercise unbearable. She'd memorized every elevation change, every defensive position, every potential cover point. Now that knowledge might be the only thing keeping her alive. The first wounded Marine she found was Private Thompson, a 20-year-old from Nebraska who joined the Corps straight out of high school. Elena had treated him twice before, once for a sprained ankle during training, once for food poisoning from a care package that had gone bad in the heat. Both times he'd been embarrassed to bother her with what he called minor stuff. Now, he lay behind an overturned supply crate, his right leg mangled by shrapnel, consciousness fading as blood soaked into the dusty ground beneath him. "Thompson, hey, stay with me," Elena whispered as she worked in the darkness, her hands finding wounds by touch more than sight. The young Marine's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with difficulty. "Doc, that really you?" His voice was weak, confused. "I thought I was dreaming. You look like an angel or something." Elena almost smiled despite their circumstances. Thompson had always been one to say exactly what he was thinking, a trait that had gotten him in trouble with his squad leaders, but endeared him to everyone else. "No angels here, just your neighborhood corpsman making house calls. Can you tell me where it hurts?" As she assessed his injuries, Elena's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Thompson just 2 days earlier. He'd been in the chow tent, staring at a letter from his girlfriend back home, his face a mixture of love and worry. The girlfriend, Sarah, was starting college in the fall, and Thompson was terrified she'd outgrow him while he was deployed. "I'm just a farm kid who joined the Marines," he'd confided to Elena over lukewarm coffee. What if she realizes she can do better than someone who shoots people for a living? Elena had wanted to tell him that he was more than his job description, that she'd watched him share his rations with hungry Afghan children, had seen him spend his free time writing letters to his younger siblings back home. But Thompson was young and scared and in love, and no amount of reassurance would quiet the voices in his head that whispered he wasn't good enough. Now, as she worked to stabilize his shattered leg, Elena realized that conversation had been more important than she'd recognized at the time. Thompson wasn't just a patient. He was a young man with dreams and fears and people who loved him. The same was true for every Marine in this compound. They weren't just tactical assets or medical cases. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, each with their own story that deserved to continue. The tourniquet she applied to Thompson's leg was one she'd practiced applying thousands of times during training. But this was the first time she'd done it while bullets whined overhead. The first time the blood was real and warm and belonged to someone who'd confessed his fears to her over bad coffee. Her hands remained steady, but her heart was breaking. For all the normalcy that war had stolen from them. "Am I going to lose it?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the terror that every wounded soldier felt when they couldn't see their injuries. "My leg, I mean. Am I going to lose my leg?" Elena looked down at the damage, assessing what she could see in the dim light. The shrapnel had missed the major arteries, but the bone was clearly fractured, possibly shattered. It would require surgery, extensive rehabilitation, months of recovery. But amputation? Not if she could help it. "You're going to keep your leg," she told him with more confidence than she felt. "But you might have to give up that running back position you've been bragging about." Thompson managed a weak laugh. He'd never played football in his life, Elena knew that from his medical history. But the joke served its purpose, giving him something to focus on besides his pain and fear. It was a technique she'd learned not from any medical textbook, but from watching her grandfather comfort wounded soldiers decades earlier. Abuelo Rodriguez had told her stories about Vietnam that never appeared in history books, stories about young men far from home who needed more than medical treatment to survive. They needed hope, human connection, the assurance that someone saw them as more than casualties. Her grandfather had carried photographs of every Marine he'd treated, had written letters to their families after he returned home. Elena had found those photographs after his funeral, hundreds of faces representing lives saved and stories preserved. As she prepared to move Thompson to safety, Elena felt the weight of that legacy. These weren't just her patients, they were her responsibility, her connection to a tradition of medics who had chosen to run toward danger when others ran away. Every decision she made tonight would echo through the lives of families she'd never met, would determine whether children grew up with fathers and mothers with sons. The thought should have been paralyzing, but instead it filled Elena with purpose. This was why she'd chosen medicine over easier paths, why she'd volunteered for deployment when she could have remained stateside. She'd wanted to make a difference, and now she was being given that chance in the most direct way possible. "Thompson, I need you to help me get you out of here," she said, slinging her medical pack across her shoulders and preparing to support his weight. "Can you put your arm around my shoulders?" The young Marine nodded, gritting his teeth as Elena helped him to his feet. His good leg trembled with the effort, but he remained upright, leaning heavily against her smaller frame. Elena was 5'6" and athletic, but Thompson outweighed her by at least 50 pounds. Under normal circumstances, moving him would have been difficult. With enemy fire still crackling around them, it seemed impossible, but Elena had always been stronger than she looked. Growing up in San Antonio as the daughter of a construction foreman and an emergency room nurse, she'd learned early that physical strength was often less important than mental toughness. Her father had taught her to change tires and fix engines. Her mother had shown her how to remain calm during medical crises. Both lessons were serving her well tonight. They moved slowly through the compound, Elena's eyes constantly scanning for threats while her mind cataloged the positions of other wounded. She could hear them calling out in the darkness American. Voices pleading for help, for water, for their mothers. Each cry felt like a fishhook in her chest, pulling her in multiple directions at once. Near the demolished communications tent, she found Sergeant Santos propped against a concrete barrier, conscious but bleeding from multiple wounds. Santos was 31, a career Marine who'd served 3 previous deployments and planned to retire in 4 years to open a restaurant in her hometown of Bayamon. Elena had spent hours listening to Santos describe the recipe she'd learned from her grandmother, traditional Puerto Rican dishes that connected her to home across thousands of miles. "Doc, thank God," Santos whispered as Elena knelt beside her. "I've been hit in 3 places, but I think they're all through and through. The bleeding's slowing down, but I'm getting dizzy." Elena's quick assessment confirmed Santos' self-diagnosis. The sergeant had taken rounds through her shoulder, thigh, and side, painful, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. What impressed Elena most was Santos' composure. Even wounded and alone in the dark, she'd maintained the tactical awareness to assess her own injuries and apply pressure to the worst bleeding. "You did good, Sergeant," Elena said as she worked to improve Santos' field dressings. "Textbook self-aid. Your drill instructors would be proud." Santos managed a grim smile. "My grandmother would be prouder." She always said the Ramirez women were too stubborn to die easy. She paused, wincing as Elena adjusted a bandage. "Doc, there are more wounded near the motor pool. I heard them calling for help maybe 10 minutes ago." Elena felt her heart sink. The motor pool was on the far side of the compound, a 200-yard journey through open ground. Getting there would mean crossing multiple fields of fire, navigating around burning vehicles, exposing herself to enemy observation for far longer than was tactically sound. It was also where PFC Martinez had been calling for help earlier. Elena had worked with Martinez on medical training exercises. He was studying to become a medic himself when his enlistment ended. The young Marine from Los Angeles had confided his plans to Elena just last week, had shown her acceptance letters to several nursing programs back home. His dream was to work in emergency medicine, to help people the way Elena was helping him now. "Santos, can you make it back to the bunker on your own?" Elena asked. "I need to get to the motor pool." The sergeant's eyes widened. "Doc, that's suicide. There's no cover between here and there, and the enemy has overwatch positions on the high ground. You'll never make it." Elena knew Santos was right from a tactical standpoint, but she also knew that Martinez was dying somewhere in the darkness, along with whoever else had been caught in the initial assault. Every minute she delayed increased the chances that they'd bleed out before help could reach them. More than that, Elena realized she was discovering something about herself that she'd never fully understood before. Throughout her life, she'd always chosen the harder path when it meant helping others. In high school, she'd tutored struggling classmates instead of socializing. In college, she'd volunteered at free clinics in underserved neighborhoods instead of taking easier electives. When she'd enlisted, she'd requested forward deployment instead of the safer stateside positions her test scores could have earned her. At the time, she'd thought these choices were about duty or compassion or living up to her grandfather's example. But sitting in the rubble of their compound, looking into Santos' worried eyes, Elena realized the truth was simpler and more complex. She couldn't bear the thought of someone suffering when she had the power to help. It wasn't heroism, it was an inability to live with herself if she chose safety over service. "Give me 5 minutes," Elena told Santos. "If I'm not back by then, make your way to the bunker and tell Chun what happened. He'll know what to do." Santos grabbed Elena's wrist with her uninjured hand. "Doc, you don't have to do this. Nobody would blame you for staying put." Elena looked down at the sergeant's face, seeing fear and admiration and something else, recognition. Santos understood what was driving her because she'd felt it too. Every Marine who'd stayed in the Corps beyond their first enlistment had faced similar moments, times when the safe choice and the right choice diverged sharply. "Yes, I do have to do this," Elena replied quietly, "because if I don't, who will?" She left Santos with extra bandages and a dose of morphine, then began the longest journey of her life. The route to the motor pool took her through terrain she'd never seen under combat conditions, familiar paths transformed by darkness and violence into an obstacle course of debris and danger. Halfway there, crouched behind the remains of what had been their recreation tent, Elena allowed herself a moment to consider what she was doing. By any reasonable standard, her actions were reckless. She was risking her life for wounded who might already be dead, abandoning established patients who needed continued care, violating every principle of military medical doctrine she'd been taught. But as she listened to Martinez's voice calling weakly from somewhere ahead, Elena knew she was exactly where she belonged. This was her purpose, the reason she'd spent years studying anatomy and trauma medicine, the fulfillment of every promise she'd made to her grandfather's memory. The scared young woman who'd arrived in Afghanistan 8 months ago was gone. In her place sat someone harder, more focused, driven by a clarity of purpose that felt almost supernatural. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a medic anymore. She was becoming something else entirely, a guardian angel with medical training and an unshakable commitment to bringing everyone home, the motor pool had been transformed into a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. What had once been an orderly collection of Humvees, supply trucks, and maintenance equipment now looked like the aftermath of an earthquake, with vehicles overturned and scattered like a child's discarded toys. The smell of burning diesel and cordite hung heavy in the air. Mixed with something else Elena tried not to identify. She found Martinez trapped beneath the front end of an overturned truck, his legs pinned but his torso free. The young Marine was conscious but fading, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Beside him lay two other Marines. Elena recognized Corporal Williams from the communications section and Private First Class Anderson from supply. Both were unconscious, their conditions impossible to assess in the dim light of burning vehicles. "Martinez, I'm here," Elena whispered as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Tell me what hurts." The young Marine's eyes focused on her with difficulty. "Doc, Jesus, I thought I was hallucinating. My legs are crushed, I think. Can't feel anything below my waist." His voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with physical pain. It was the fear every young soldier felt when they realized their body might be permanently broken. Elena's quick assessment revealed the grim truth. Martinez's pelvis was likely fractured, possibly shattered, and there was significant internal bleeding. Under ideal conditions, with a full surgical team and immediate evacuation, his injuries would be survivable but life-altering. Here, with limited supplies and no backup, Elena was performing medical miracles with nothing but determination and basic trauma supplies. But she'd worked miracles before. During her residency rotation in the emergency department at Brooke Army Medical Center, she'd helped save a construction worker who'd fallen 4 stories, had assisted in surgery on a child who'd been struck by a drunk driver, had spent 16 hours straight treating casualties from a multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 35. Each case had taught her that the human body was simultaneously fragile and incredibly resilient, that sometimes the difference between life and death was simply refusing to give up. "Martinez, remember when you told me about wanting to be a nurse?" Elena said as she worked to control his bleeding. "About working in the emergency room back home?" The young Marine's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope. "Yeah. Doc, UCLA Medical Center. My cousin works there, says they're always looking for good people." Elena smiled as she inserted in-4 into Martinez's arm, her movements automatic despite the chaos around them. "Well, you're getting practical experience tonight. This is what emergency medicine looks like, making life and death decisions with incomplete information and improvised equipment. You're going to have stories that'll impress the hell out of your nursing school instructors." It was a conversation that served multiple purposes. Keeping Martinez talking helped monitor his consciousness level while giving him something to focus on besides his pain. But more than that, it reminded both of them that his life extended beyond this moment, that he had a future worth fighting for. As Elena worked on Martinez, she became aware of other sounds in the darkness movement, voices speaking in Dari and Pashto, the enemy forces that had breached their perimeter. They were closer now, moving systematically through the compound, searching for intelligence or perhaps hunting for survivors. Elena realized with cold clarity that she was running out of time. The truck pinning Martinez was too heavy for her to move alone, but she noticed something that sparked an idea. The vehicle was balanced precariously on a pile of debris, held in position more by chance than physics. If she could shift the weight distribution, maybe create a fulcrum point. Elena single quotes S. father had been a construction foreman for 30 years before his retirement, and she'd spent countless summer afternoons watching him solve problems with physics and leverage rather than brute force. "It's not about being stronger," he'd always told her. "It's about being smarter." Using a piece of twisted metal as a lever and a concrete block as a fulcrum, Elena managed to shift the truck's weight just enough to free Martinez's legs. The young Marine screamed as circulation returned to his crushed limbs. But Elena knew pain was a good sign. It meant the nerves were still functional. With Martinez freed, Elena turned her attention to the other casualties. Corporal Williams was unconscious but breathing, suffering from what appeared to be a severe concussion and possible internal injuries. Private Anderson had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen, wounds that would require immediate surgery if he was going to survive. Elena found herself facing an impossible choice. She could stabilize one patient thoroughly, giving them the best chance of survival while the others died waiting. Or she could provide minimal care to all three, hoping it would be enough to keep them alive until help arrived. Neither option was acceptable by the standards she'd set for herself. Instead, she chose a third path, one that would have terrified her supervisors but felt absolutely right in the moment. Elena began treating all three simultaneously, moving between patients with a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her training. She'd apply pressure to William's head wound, then adjust Anderson's position to improve his breathing. Then check Martinez's IV flow. Then cycle back through the sequence. It was medical triage performed like a dance, each movement flowing into the next with practiced precision. Elena's hands seemed to know where they needed to be before her conscious mind had time to decide. She'd found a state of focused calm that she'd only experienced a few times before in her life, during the most challenging surgeries, the most critical moments when failure meant death. As she worked, Elena's mind wandered to a conversation she'd had with Chun 3 weeks earlier. They'd been discussing the philosophical aspects of military medicine, the ethical complexities of treating soldiers who would return to combat and might be wounded again. Chun had argued that their job was simply to heal, not to judge or question the larger context of war. Elena had disagreed, though not strongly enough to create conflict with her closest friend. She believed that military medics were more than technicians. They were guardians of humanity in the most inhumane circumstances. Every life saved was a victory against the forces that reduced human beings to statistics and casualties. Now, kneeling in the rubble with 3 dying Marines depending on her, Elena understood that the philosophical debate had been academic. What mattered wasn't theory or doctrine or even the tactical situation. What mattered was the simple fundamental truth that these young men deserved to go home to their families, to live the lives they'd dreamed about during quiet moments between missions. Martinez was going to study nursing and work alongside his cousin at UCLA. Williams had shown Elena pictures of his newborn daughter just last month, had talked about teaching her to fish when she was old enough. Anderson wrote poetry in his spare time, verses about home and love and the beauty he'd found even in this harsh landscape. These weren't just medical cases or tactical assets. They were complete human beings with hopes and fears, and people who loved them. Elena's job wasn't just to treat their wounds. It was to preserve their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Elena looked up to see figures moving through the smoke and debris, but these weren't enemy soldiers. They were Americans, Marines from the perimeter, who'd fought their way through to the motor pool, drawn by the sounds of her work. "Doc, thank Christ," gasped Sergeant Peterson, a squad leader she'd treated for a minor infection 2 weeks earlier. "We heard someone was still alive over here. How many wounded?" 3 critical, all requiring immediate evacuation," Elena replied without looking up from her work. "Martinez has crushed pelvis and possible internal bleeding. Williams has severe head trauma. Anderson has penetrating chest and abdominal wounds. I've got them stabilized, but they need surgical intervention within the hour." Peterson's expression grew grim as he surveyed the tactical situation. "Doc, we're cut off from the main base, and all the birds are grounded. Ground evacuation isn't possible with enemy forces still in the area. We might have to wait until morning." Elena felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Morning was 8 hours away. Martinez might last that long with proper fluids and pain management. Williams and Anderson wouldn't. They needed surgery now, needed resources she didn't have and couldn't improvise, unless she created those resources herself. The idea that formed in Elena's mind was audacious to the point of insanity. But as she looked at the faces of the Marines who were depending on her, she realized it might be their only chance. "Peterson, I need you to gather every available Marine and establish a defensive perimeter around this position," she ordered. "And find me every medical supply in the compound, not just from the destroyed hospital tent, but from every first aid kit, every vehicle, every personal stash anyone might have." The sergeant stared at her with confusion and something that might have been awe. "Doc, what are you planning?" Elena looked up at him, her face streaked with blood and dust, but her eyes blazing with determination that seemed almost supernatural. In the flickering light of burning vehicles, "I'm going to perform field surgery," she said simply. "Right here, right now. Because these Marines are not going to die on my watch." The makeshift operating theater Elena created in the ruins of the motor pool defied every principle of sterile procedure she'd ever learned. Using the overturned truck as a windbreak and a salvaged tarp for overhead cover, she transformed a patch of blood-soaked ground into something resembling a field hospital. Battery-powered work lights, scavenged from disabled vehicles, provided illumination that was better than moonlight, but far from surgical standards. But Elena had learned something during her months in Afghanistan that no medical textbook could have taught her sometimes. The difference between life and death wasn't perfect conditions, but the willingness to work with whatever was available. Tonight, what was available was her training, her determination, and a collection of Marines who trusted her completely. Sergeant Peterson had followed her orders without question, establishing a defensive perimeter that turned their small section of the motor pool into a fortress. 6 Marines with rifles created overlapping fields of fire, while 2 more scavenged medical supplies from across the compound. Within 20 minutes, Elena had assembled an improvised surgical kit that would have horrified her instructors. Represented the best available care under impossible circumstances. The first injustice came as she prepared to operate on Anderson's chest wounds. Enemy mortar rounds began falling with renewed intensity, forcing her Marines to take cover while she continued working. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the ground that threatened her precision, but Elena's hands remained steady. She'd learned to work through distractions during her trauma rotations, had performed procedures while ambulances screamed outside emergency room windows and families wept in nearby hallways. But this was different. This was warfare trying to actively prevent her from saving lives, violence attempting to compound itself through her failure. Every mortar round felt personal, as if the enemy had identified her specifically as a threat to their objectives. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She carried no weapons, posed no direct military threat, yet her medical skills made her more dangerous to enemy morale than a squad of riflemen. "Doc, they're trying to bracket our position," Peterson called from his fighting hole. "We might need to move these casualties." Elena didn't look up from Anderson's chest cavity, where she was attempting to repair damage to his lung with instruments designed for basic first aid rather than surgery. "Negative. Moving them now will kill them. We hold this position until I'm finished." The authority in her voice surprised everyone, including Elena herself. She'd never given orders to combat Marines before, had always deferred to senior enlisted personnel and officers in tactical situations. But tonight was revealing capabilities she didn't know she possessed, leadership skills that emerged naturally. When lives hung in the balance, the second injustice arrived in the form of Major Harrison, their battalion surgeon, crackling through Peterson's radio with growing frustration. "What the hell is Corman Rodriguez doing out there?" Harrison's voice carried clearly through the tactical net. "I'm ordering her to cease all unauthorized medical procedures and return to the bunker immediately." Elena felt her jaw clench as she continued suturing Anderson's lung tissue. Major Harrison was a competent surgeon and a decent officer, but he'd never worked outside the controlled environment of a field hospital. He understood medicine but not the realities of combat trauma. Not the calculations that medics made when proper procedure meant certain death for their patients. Peterson, tell the Major that I'm performing life-saving surgery on 3 critical casualties who will die without immediate intervention, Elena said, her voice carrying the kind of cold professionalism that brooked no argument. Tell him that. I'll return to the bunker when my patients are stable and not 1 second before. Peterson hesitated, understanding the implications of such direct defiance of a superior officer. Doc, that's insubordination. Harrison could have you court-martialed. Elena's hands never paused in their work. Then he can court-martial me from the grave I'll be standing over if I follow his orders. These Marines are not dying tonight. Not on my watch, not while I have the skills to save them. The third injustice was more subtle but perhaps more cutting. As Elena worked through the night, she became aware of conversations among the Marines protecting her position. Some praised her courage and skill, calling her the best medic they'd ever seen. But others questioned her judgment, wondering if she was showboating or suffering from combat stress that had impaired her decision-making. She's good, but this is crazy, she heard Lance Corporal Murphy whisper to another Marine. No corpsman should be doing surgery in a combat zone. What if she makes things worse? Elena understood their concern. What she was attempting went far beyond the scope of practice for a Navy corpsman, ventured into territory that belonged to surgeons with years of additional training. Under normal circumstances, her actions would be considered reckless, potentially criminal negligence, but these weren't normal circumstances. Normal circumstances included evacuation, helicopters in field hospitals, and the luxury of following proper medical protocols. Tonight, Elena was the only surgeon her patients would ever see, the final barrier between them and death. The fourth injustice came from an unexpected source, her own body. After 6 hours of continuous surgery performed in combat conditions, Elena's hands began to shake with exhaustion. Her vision blurred from dehydration and stress. Her back ached from working hunched over patients on the ground. Every medical school instructor had emphasized the importance of physician self-care, the need to maintain personal health in order to provide optimal patient care. But there was no relief available, no colleague to spell her while she rested. The Marines protecting her perimeter were already fighting beyond their normal endurance, sustained only by their faith in her abilities. If Elena faltered now, if she allowed fatigue to compromise her judgment, 3 young men would die because she'd reached the limits of human performance. Instead of giving in to exhaustion, Elena found reserves she didn't know existed. She drew strength from Martinez's steady breathing, from the gradual improvement in Anderson's vital signs, from William's slowly clearing consciousness. Each small victory provided energy for the next procedure, the next decision, the next desperate gamble with death. The fifth injustice was systematic and deliberate. As dawn approached, enemy forces began targeting medical personnel specifically. Elena realized they'd identified her position and were attempting to eliminate her not for tactical reasons, but to demoralize the defending Marines. Snipers fired at anyone wearing Red Cross markings. Mortar targeted the improvised surgical area with increasing accuracy. It was a violation of the Geneva Conventions, a war crime by any reasonable standard. Medical personnel were supposed to be protected combatants, their neutrality respected even in the heat of battle. But Elena had learned that international law meant little to fighters, who saw her medical skills as a threat to their psychological warfare. They're hunting you specifically, Doc, Peterson observed grimly as another sniper round cracked overhead. Word must have gotten out that you're saving everyone they're trying to kill. Elena felt a cold anger building in her chest, different from anything she'd experienced before. She'd accepted the dangers of military service, understood that combat medics faced unique risks. But this was different. This was targeting her not for the threat she posed with weapons, but for the hope she represented to wounded Marines. "Let them come," she said quietly, her hands never pausing in their work on William's skull fracture. "I've got more Marines to save, and they can't kill all of us." The sixth injustice arrived with the morning light, when Elena discovered that their radio communications had been compromised. Enemy forces had been listening to their tactical nets, using information about casualty locations and medical procedures to target American positions more effectively. Every call for medical evacuation had been intercepted. Every update on patient conditions had been turned into intelligence for enemy mortar. Elena realized with sickening clarity that her efforts to coordinate care had been used against them, that her attempts to save lives had inadvertently provided targeting information to those trying to take them. The weight of that knowledge threatened to crush her spirit, to undermine the confidence that had carried her through the night. But as she looked at the faces of the Marines she'd saved, Martinez sitting up and talking despite his injuries, Anderson breathing steadily after his lung repair, Williams asking coherent questions about his condition, Elena found the strength to continue. Whatever mistakes she'd made, whatever inadvertent assistance she'd provided to the enemy, these three men were alive because of her actions. The seventh injustice was personal and devastating. As Elena prepared to evacuate her patients to a more secure location, she received word that the bunker where she'd left her original casualties had been overrun during the night. Chun was missing, possibly captured or killed. Davies, the young Marine from Oklahoma who'd trusted her completely, was among the casualties. Elena felt something break inside her chest, a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. She'd saved 3 lives at the cost of abandoning others, had made impossible choices that seemed right at the time but now felt like betrayal. The mathematics of triage were cold and logical on paper, but devastating when applied to people who'd depended on her. "Doc, it's not your fault," Peterson said, reading the anguish in her face. "You couldn't have saved everyone. What you did tonight, it was impossible, but you did it anyway." Elena nodded numbly, but the words felt hollow. She understood intellectually that she'd made the best decisions possible under impossible circumstances. But understanding didn't ease the pain of knowing that her choices had consequences, that every life saved might have come at the cost of another. The eighth and final injustice of that terrible night came with the arrival of reinforcements at 0800 hours. A company of Marines from the main base fought their way through to the compound, bringing medical evacuation helicopters and proper surgical equipment. Elena's patients were loaded onto stretchers and airlifted to field hospitals where real surgeons could complete the work she'd begun. But instead of praise or recognition, Elena found herself facing a formal investigation. Major Harrison had filed charges of insubordination and practicing medicine beyond her scope of training. Military lawyers wanted to review every decision she'd made, every procedure she'd performed, every order she'd disobeyed. "Corman Rodriguez, you're facing possible court-martial for your actions last night," Captain Williams informed her as medics finally began treating her own injuries, cuts and bruises she'd ignored while caring for others. "Until this investigation is complete, you're relieved of all medical duties." Elena felt the final injustice settle around her like a weight. She'd saved lives that would have been lost, had performed medical miracles under impossible conditions, had proven that human determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And her reward was potential imprisonment, the destruction of her career, the loss of everything she'd worked to achieve. But as she was led away from the compound that had been her home, Elena passed a group of Marines who'd been at the motor pool during the night. They stood at attention as she walked by, offering silent salutes that spoke louder than any official commendation. In their eyes she saw recognition of what she'd accomplished, understanding of the price she'd paid to bring their brothers home. Peterson broke ranks to approach her, his voice low but carrying clearly in the morning air. "Doc, what you did last night, ... That wasn't just medicine. That was something else entirely. Something none of us will ever forget." Elena nodded once, then allowed herself to be escorted to the investigation that would determine her future. But as she walked, she carried with her the knowledge that she'd discovered something about herself during that terrible night. She'd found reserves of courage and skill and determination that she'd never known existed. Whatever happened next, whatever price she paid for her actions, she'd proven to herself and others that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when lives hung in the balance. The scared young medic who'd arrived in Afghanistan 8 months earlier was gone forever. In her place walked someone harder, more focused, shaped by violence into an instrument of healing that would never again accept the unacceptable or retreat from the impossible. But the injustices weren't finished with Elena Rodriguez. As she sat in the temporary detention facility, a converted shipping container that served as a holding cell, she learned about the ninth injustice through whispered conversations between her guards. The official reports of the night's action made no mention of her surgical interventions, no reference to the lives she'd saved through direct violation of military medical protocols. Instead, the incident was being described as a tactical evacuation. Under fire, with credit given to the Marines who'd established the defensive perimeter. Elena's role was minimized to routine medical support, as if she'd done nothing more than apply bandages and dispense pain medication. The transformation of 3 dying Marines into stable patients was attributed to proper field dressing techniques and timely evacuation to appropriate medical facilities. The sanitization of her actions felt like erasure, as if the military hierarchy was determined to pretend that nothing extraordinary had happened. Elena understood the political calculations involved. Acknowledging what she'd accomplished would require admitting that standard medical protocols were sometimes inadequate, that individual initiative could trump institutional doctrine. The cost of that denial was the loss of lessons that could save lives in future conflicts. Other medics would face similar situations without the benefit of learning from her experience, would be forced to rediscover techniques and decision-making processes that Elena had pioneered under fire. The 10th injustice emerged through letters that somehow found their way to her detention cell. Families of the Marines she'd treated had been told their sons and husbands had been wounded in action, but saved by exceptional medical care. They'd written to thank the unknown medics who'd preserved their loved ones, never knowing that one woman's defiance of orders had made the difference between homecoming and funeral. Elena read each letter with growing emotional weight. Martinez's mother wrote about her son's plans to become a nurse, about how proud she was that he'd survived to pursue his dreams. Anderson's girlfriend described their upcoming wedding, thanking God and the military medical corps for bringing her fiancé home alive. William's wife sent pictures of their daughter's first steps, milestones that would have been shadowed by grief without Elena's intervention. These families would never know her name, would never understand the price she'd paid to preserve their happiness. Their gratitude was directed toward an anonymous medical system rather than the individual who'd risked everything to save their loved ones. Elena found the anonymity both frustrating and strangely comforting. She hadn't acted for recognition. But the complete absence of acknowledgement felt like a unique form of punishment. The 11th injustice was perhaps the most personal. Elena learned that Chun, her closest friend and fellow corpsman, had indeed survived the bunker assault but had been evacuated with severe injuries. He was recovering at a military hospital in Germany, but brain trauma had left him with memory loss that included the 8 months they'd served together. Elena would never be able to discuss the night's events with the one person who truly understood her motivations, would never receive validation from the colleague who'd supported her through the hardest moments of deployment. Chun's injuries had robbed her of the one witness who could testify to her competence and character, leaving her to face the investigation alone. The final injustice was discovered through official documents that Elena wasn't supposed to see but that sympathetic personnel shared with her. The 3 Marines she'd saved were recovering ahead of all medical projections, their conditions stable enough to allow transport to hospitals in the United States. But their medical records contained no mention of field surgery, no reference to the procedures that had preserved their lives. Instead, their recoveries were attributed to rapid evacuation and proper initial treatment, language that suggested they'd received standard care rather than the extraordinary interventions that had actually saved them. Elena realized that her patients would never know how close they'd come to death, would never understand that their survival had required someone to risk everything on their behalf. In military medical culture, such anonymity was sometimes considered the highest honor, to save lives without recognition, to serve without reward. But Elena found the erasure of her actions deeply troubling, not for personal reasons, but because it suggested that the system valued conformity over innovation, obedience over results. As she awaited her court-martial hearing, Elena reflected on the strange mathematics of military justice. She'd violated orders to save lives, had exceeded her authorized scope of practice to preserve 3 young men who might otherwise have died. Her actions had been successful by any objective measure. All 3 patients had survived and were recovering fully, yet she faced potential imprisonment, while those who would have enforced protocols that meant certain death for her patients faced no consequences at all. The system seemed designed to punish initiative, to discourage exactly the kind of quick thinking and decisive action that had defined military medical heroes throughout history. But Elena had learned something about herself during that terrible night that no court-martial could take away. She'd discovered reserves of courage and skill that she'd never known existed, had proven to herself that she could perform under pressure that would break most people. Whatever punishment the military imposed, whatever price she paid for her actions, she'd carry the knowledge that she'd been tested in the most extreme circumstances and had not been found wanting. The scared young medic who'd arrived in Afghanistan 8 months earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true medical practice sometimes required choosing between institutional approval and patient survival. Elena had made her choice and would live with the consequences, secure in the knowledge that she'd remained faithful to the most fundamental principle of medicine. First, do no harm. Even if doing no harm meant risking everything else in the process. The truth began to emerge 3 weeks later, not through official channels but through the informal network of Marines who had witnessed Elena's actions firsthand. Sergeant Peterson, despite orders to avoid discussing the incident, had been quietly documenting testimonies from every Marine who'd been present during the night assault. His unofficial investigation included detailed accounts of Elena's surgical procedures, photographic evidence of the improvised operating theater, and medical assessments that proved her interventions had been the difference between life and death. Peterson's motivation was personal and profound. His younger brother had been killed in Iraq 2 years earlier, dying from wounds that might have been survivable with more aggressive medical intervention. When he watched Elena risk everything to save Martinez, Anderson, and Williams, he saw the kind of medic his brother had needed but never found. The sergeant understood that Elena's court-martial wasn't just about military discipline, it was about whether the corps would punish the kind of initiative that saved Marines' lives. The first revelation came when Peterson shared his evidence with Master Sergeant Maria Santos, Elena's former patient who had since been evacuated to Walter Reed Medical Center. Santos was recovering from her own wounds, but had retained enough of her memory to understand the significance of what she was seeing. As a career Marine with 15 years of service, she possessed both the credibility and the connections to bring Elena's case to the attention of senior leadership. "Sir, with respect, you need to see this," Santos told Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander, during a routine medical evaluation. What happened that night? It wasn't just medical treatment. It was something that needs to be recognized and studied, not buried under charges of insubordination. Colonel Mitchell was a pragmatic officer. who'd risen through the ranks by making decisions based on results rather than regulations. When Santos showed him Peterson's documentation, he realized that Elena's court-martial had the potential to become a public relations nightmare for the Corps. More importantly, he began to understand that her techniques might represent innovations that could save lives in future conflicts. The second revelation came from an unexpected source, Major Harrison, the battalion surgeon who had initially filed charges against Elena. 3 weeks of reflection and consultation with colleagues at military medical centers had given Harrison a different perspective on the night's events. He'd reviewed Elena's improvised surgical procedures with trauma surgeons who worked in civilian emergency departments, experts who dealt regularly with unconventional treatment situations. "Colonel, I need to withdraw my charges against Corpsman Rodriguez," Harrison told Mitchell during a private meeting. "I've had her case reviewed by trauma specialists at Johns Hopkins and shock trauma in Baltimore. Their assessment is unanimous. Her surgical interventions were not only appropriate, but were performed at a level that would be impressive for a resident surgeon, let alone a corpsman." Harrison's change of heart was driven by more than professional consultation. He'd received a letter from Martinez's family, thanking him personally for saving their son's life. The surgeon realized that he was receiving credit for Elena's work, recognition that belonged to someone facing imprisonment for her actions. His military honor wouldn't allow him to accept praise for procedures he'd never performed. The third revelation was the most dramatic and came from Martinez himself. Despite regulations prohibiting patient contact with medical personnel under investigation, the young Marine had convinced his nurse to help him place a video call to Elena's legal counsel. What Martinez revealed fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of what had happened in the motor pool. "Sir, Doc Rodriguez didn't just save my life," Martinez explained to Captain Sarah Thompson, Elena's assigned military lawyer. "She taught me how to assist with my own surgery. When she was operating on the other guys, she had me monitor vital signs and help with medical procedures. I saw everything she did, understood every decision she made. She wasn't reckless or showing off. She was the most focused professional medic I've ever seen." Martinez's testimony was supported by similar accounts from Anderson and Williams, who had recovered enough to provide detailed statements about their treatment. All three Marines painted the same picture. Elena had performed medical miracles under impossible conditions, had saved lives that would have been lost under standard protocols, had demonstrated skills and judgment that exceeded anything they'd witnessed from more senior medical personnel. The fourth revelation came through intelligence reports that had been classified until Peterson's investigation brought them to light. Enemy communications intercepted during the battle revealed that Elena's medical work had been specifically targeted because of its effectiveness. Taliban fighters had received orders to eliminate the American surgeon, who was preventing their psychological warfare from achieving desired effects. They knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, the intelligence officer, explained to Colonel Mitchell. This wasn't random targeting of medical personnel. They identified Corpsman Rodriguez as a specific threat to their operations because her medical skills were saving lives they expected to claim. The enemy's recognition of Elena's capabilities provided powerful validation of her effectiveness while simultaneously demonstrating the strategic importance of advanced medical training for combat corpsmen. Her improvised surgery hadn't just saved individual lives, it had disrupted enemy tactical plans and provided psychological support to defending Marines, who knew their medic would risk everything to bring them home. The fifth revelation emerged from medical records that had been sealed pending the investigation. Elena's 3 patients had all exceeded recovery projections by significant margins, their healing processes accelerated by the quality of initial treatment they'd received. Martinez was walking with assistance 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Anderson's Lung function had returned to normal when doctors had predicted permanent respiratory limitations. Williams showed no signs of the cognitive impairment typically associated with his type of head trauma. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma surgeon at Brooke Army Medical Center who reviewed the cases, provided written testimony that would become central. To Elena's defense, the surgical interventions performed by HM2 Rodriguez demonstrate a level of technical skill and clinical judgment that would be exceptional in a controlled operating room environment. That she achieved these results under combat conditions, with improvised equipment and no surgical support staff, represents medical performance that I can only describe as extraordinary. The sixth revelation was personal and came from Chun, Elena's former partner who had recovered enough of his memory to provide testimony. Despite his traumatic brain injury, Chun retained clear recollections of Elena's medical capabilities and the trust that other Marines placed in her judgment. His statement to investigators was brief but powerful. Elena Rodriguez is the best medic I've ever worked with. If I were wounded in combat, she's the only person I'd want treating me. What happened that night wasn't insubordination, it was heroism. The seventh revelation came through congressional interest in Elena's case. Representative Maria Gonzalez, a former Army nurse who served on the House Armed Services Committee, had learned about the court-martial through veteran advocacy groups. Gonzalez understood that Elena's situation represented larger issues about military medical training and the scope of practice for combat medics. Her office began investigating why a medic who had saved lives was facing imprisonment while systemic problems in military medicine went unaddressed. This young woman did exactly what we train our medics to do. She saved lives, Gonzalez stated during a committee hearing that received national media attention. If we're going to court-martial people for being too good at their jobs, we're sending a message that will discourage exactly the kind of initiative we need in combat zones. The eighth and final revelation was the most significant and came from an investigation into the broader medical response during the night assault. Elena's actions had been part of a larger pattern of medical innovation under extreme conditions, with multiple corpsmen and medics making decisions that exceeded their authorized scope of practice. But while others had performed standard trauma procedures, only Elena had attempted and succeeded at complex surgery that required years of specialized training. The investigation revealed that Elena's medical knowledge extended far beyond standard corpsman training. She had completed advanced trauma courses during her off-duty time, had studied surgical procedures through correspondence courses and online medical education programs. Her decision to perform surgery hadn't been reckless, it had been informed by extensive preparation that she'd pursued independently, because she recognized the limitations of standard training. Colonel Mitchell's final meeting with Elena took place in his office rather than the detention facility, a change of venue that signaled the dramatic shift in how her case was being viewed. The colonel was a practical man who understood that military justice should serve the institution's interests while maintaining its values. Elena's situation presented an opportunity to do both. "Corpsman Rodriguez, I'm dropping all charges against you," Mitchell announced without preamble. "Furthermore, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion and for advanced medical training that will formalize the skills you've demonstrated in combat." Elena felt a mixture of relief and vindication, but also something else, a recognition that her actions had changed not just her own future, but potentially the way the military approached combat medicine. She had proven that individual initiative could achieve results that no amount of regulation or standardization could provide. "Sir, what about the Marines who were present that night?" Elena asked. "They took risks to support my medical work. They deserve recognition for what they did." Mitchell nodded approvingly. Elena's first concern was for her Marines rather than her own vindication, exactly the response he'd hoped for. "They'll all receive appropriate recognition. Sergeant Peterson will be recommended for promotion." The Marines who held the perimeter will receive commendations for their actions under fire. As Elena left the colonel's office, she realized that the truth about that night would never be fully captured in official reports or medal citations. The real story was more complex than any single narrative could contain. It was about Marines taking care of Marines, about choosing humanity over regulations, about discovering that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when lives hung in the balance. 6 months after the charges were dropped, Elena stood in the auditorium of the Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, wearing dress blues adorned with ribbons that told the story of her transformation from frightened recruit to decorated hero. The Navy Cross hanging from her chest represented the second highest award for valor, recognition that her actions had transcended normal expectations of duty and entered the realm of legendary military medicine. But the medal ceremony was only the visible symbol of changes that had begun reverberating throughout the military medical system. Elena's case had sparked a comprehensive review of combat medic training protocols, leading to the development of advanced surgical courses that prepared corpsmen for exactly the situation she had faced. The program, officially designated as the Enhanced Combat Medical Training Initiative, was informally known throughout the Corps as Rodriguez Rules procedures that authorized field medics to exceed traditional scope of practice when patient survival was at stake. The first class of medics to complete the enhanced training included Martinez, who had recovered fully from his injuries and requested assignment as a combat corpsman. His experience as Elena's patient had convinced him that he wanted to provide the same level of care that had saved his life. During the graduation ceremony, Martinez approached Elena with tears in his eyes and a question that had haunted him. "For months, Doc, why did you risk everything for us? You could have followed orders, stayed safe, avoided the court-martial. Nobody would have blamed you for playing it safe." Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer would be repeated in barracks and training centers for years to come. "Because that's not who I am," she said finally. "And more importantly, it's not who you needed me to be. When someone's life is in your hands, you don't worry about regulations or career consequences. You do whatever it takes to bring them home." The changes Elena had initiated extended beyond training protocols to fundamental shifts in military medical culture. Combat hospitals began stockpiling surgical equipment at forward operating bases, acknowledging that sometimes medics would need to perform procedures traditionally reserved for surgeons. Communication protocols were revised to prevent enemy interception of medical information. Most significantly, field commanders received new guidance emphasizing that medical personnel should be given maximum latitude to make life and death decisions without fear of disciplinary action. Colonel Mitchell, who had been promoted to general, largely on the strength of his handling of Elena's case, established a new policy framework that balanced military discipline with medical necessity. The Mitchell Doctrine stated that medical personnel would not face punishment for exceeding their authorized scope of practice if their actions could be demonstrated to have saved lives and were based on reasonable medical judgment. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Elena had been offered several prestigious assignments, instructor positions at military medical schools, advisory roles in medical policy development, opportunities to serve in cushioned positions that would never again require her to make life and death decisions under fire. She had declined them all, choosing instead to return to combat deployment as a Fleet Marine Force corpsman. "I'm not a symbol or a policy expert," she explained to General Mitchell during their final meeting before her new deployment. "I'm a medic. My place is with Marines who might need someone willing to risk everything to bring them home." Elena's decision to return to combat assignments sent a powerful message throughout the military medical community. She could have leveraged her heroic status into a comfortable career, could have spent the remainder of her service giving speeches and attending ceremonies. Instead, she chose to continue doing the dangerous, vital work that had defined her. During the darkest night of her life, Her new assignment took her to a forward operating base in Syria, where Marines were engaged in operations against ISIS forces that showed the same disregard for Geneva Convention protections of medical personnel. Elena's reputation had preceded her, and she found herself working with Marines who treated her with a mixture of respect and awe that was both gratifying and occasionally overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, Elena's new team leader, had studied Elena's techniques during advanced combat medic training and understood the significance of working with a living legend. "Having Rodriguez on our team changes everything," Walsh confided to her platoon sergeant. "The Marines know that if they get hit, they've got the best possible chance of coming home. That kind of confidence makes them more effective in combat." But Elena discovered that her reputation also carried unexpected responsibilities. Young corpsmen sought her mentorship, asking for guidance that went beyond medical procedures to questions of courage, judgment, and the moral complexities of military medicine. She found herself serving as an unofficial philosopher for medics who faced the same impossible choices she had confronted in Afghanistan. How do you know when to break the rules? Hospitalman Ashley Torres asked during one of their regular training sessions. Torres was 21, fresh from Corps school, struggling with the gap between textbook medicine and combat reality. Elena considered the question, while she demonstrated advanced suturing techniques on a practice mannequin. "You don't break rules," she said finally. "You follow the most important rule of all: save lives by any means necessary. Everything else is just administrative guidance." The teaching role came naturally to Elena, perhaps because she understood that her real legacy wouldn't be the medals or policy changes, but the medic she trained to think beyond conventional limitations. Each conversation, each demonstration, each shared experience added to a growing body of knowledge that would save lives long after her own service ended. 3 years after the motor pool incident, Elena received news that validated every risk she had taken. Martinez had completed nursing school and was working in the emergency department at UCLA Medical Center, where his combat medical experience made him an invaluable asset during trauma cases. Anderson had become a paramedic in his hometown, using skills learned from watching Elena work to save lives in civilian emergency services. Williams had joined the police department and was serving as a field training officer, teaching younger officers the importance of aggressive medical intervention during emergencies. Each of these men had been transformed by their experience of being saved against impossible odds, and each was now in a position to extend that same aggressive commitment to preserving life. Elena realized that her actions had created a multiplier effect. 3 saved lives had become dozens, then hundreds, as her former patients applied the lessons they'd learned during the darkest night of their military service. The ripple effects extended to their families as well. Martinez's mother had become a volunteer at Veterans Hospital, inspired by her son's survival to support other military families facing medical crises. Anderson's wife had started a nonprofit organization that provided support for families of wounded veterans, using her experience of nearly losing her husband to help others navigate similar challenges. William's daughter, now old enough to understand that her father had almost died before she was born, had announced her intention to study medicine and serve as a military doctor. Elena's story had become part of military medical folklore, shared in training centers and barracks around the world. But the version that was passed down focused less on her individual heroism than on the principle she had embodied, that saving lives was worth any personal cost, that medical personnel had an obligation to push beyond conventional limitations. When human life was at stake, the official recognition came in various forms over the years. Elena was promoted ahead of her peers, assigned to increasingly responsible positions, invited to speak at medical conferences and military academies. But the recognition that mattered most came from the Marines she served with, who trusted her completely because they knew she would risk everything to bring them home. 5 years after the motor pool incident, Elena was serving as the senior enlisted medical advisor to a Marine Expeditionary Unit when she received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Davy's mother, the young Marine from Oklahoma who had died in the bunker while Elena was saving others in the motor pool. "I know you blame yourself for not being there when my son needed you," the letter read. "But I want you to know that Tommy wouldn't want you to carry that guilt. He wrote to me about you many times, describing how you cared for everyone like they were your own family. He would be proud of what you've accomplished, proud that his death contributed to changes that will save other mothers' sons." Elena realized as she read the letter that she had been carrying guilt for Davy's death throughout all her subsequent service, a weight that had driven her to ever greater efforts to save others. His mother's words didn't erase that guilt entirely, but they transformed it into something more constructive, a reminder of the cost of her choices and the importance of never taking her responsibilities lightly. The letter also contained a photograph of Davy's grave marker, which included an inscription that took Elena's breath away. He served with Marines who never left anyone behind. Elena understood that she had become part of a tradition that extended far beyond her individual actions, a commitment to caring for Marines that was passed down through generations of corpsmen who chose service over safety. As Elena prepared for her next deployment, she reflected on how much she had changed since that terrified young woman had first arrived in Afghanistan. The scared medic who had worried about making mistakes had been replaced by a confident professional who understood that sometimes the greatest mistake was failing to act. The rule follower who had depended on protocols and procedures had evolved into a leader who understood that saving lives sometimes required breaking every rule in the book. But the most important change was subtler and more profound. Elena had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined, that ordinary people could indeed do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. That knowledge had transformed not just her approach to medicine, but her entire understanding of human potential and responsibility. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, she had completed her medical degree through a military program that fast-tracked exceptional corpsmen into physician roles, stood before a new class of combat medics, her own students now. The young faces looking back at her carried the same mixture of determination and uncertainty she remembered from her own early days in the Corps, but they were different too, shaped by new realities and higher expectations that her actions had helped create. Today we're going to study a case that changed how we think about combat medicine. Elena began, clicking to a slide that showed the ruins of a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It involves a medic who faced impossible choices and discovered that sometimes the right decision is the one that breaks every rule you've been taught. The students leaned forward, recognizing this as more than just another training scenario. Elena never revealed that she was teaching her own story, allowing them to analyze the decisions objectively before understanding the personal cost of each choice. It was a teaching method that had proven remarkably effective at preparing medics for the moral complexities they would face in combat. Hospitalman, second-class Maria Santos, daughter of the Sergeant Elena had treated years earlier, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what was the outcome for the medic in this case? Did she face disciplinary action?" Elena smiled, recognizing her former patient's fierce intelligence in her daughter's eyes. The medic faced a court-martial that was eventually dropped. But more importantly, her actions led to fundamental changes in how we train combat medical personnel. The techniques she pioneered are now standard curriculum in advanced trauma courses. What Elena didn't mention was that Maria Santos had specifically requested assignment to her training program, driven by stories her mother had told about the medic who had saved her life. The young woman embodied the next generation of military medics, better trained, more confident, prepared for situations that had once been considered impossible. After the class ended, Elena found herself in her office reviewing applications for the new Advanced Combat Surgical Program. The initiative had grown from a pilot project into a comprehensive certification that allowed exceptional corpsmen to perform procedures once reserved for surgeons. Elena served as the program director, responsible for identifying medics who possessed both the technical skills and moral courage necessary for such responsibilities. Among the applications was one that stopped her cold: a letter from Chun, her former partner who had recovered from his traumatic brain injury and was requesting return to active duty. His medical clearance was comprehensive, indicating full recovery of cognitive function and motor skills. But Elena knew that his decision to return to combat medicine was driven by more than just professional obligation. "I remember everything." Now, Chun had written in his personal statement, "Not just the medical procedures and tactical situations, but the choices you made that night. I want to be the kind of medic who makes those same choices when they're needed. I want to serve with people who understand that saving lives is worth any personal cost." Elena approved Chun's application immediately, then added a personal note recommending him for accelerated training. His experience as both a medic and a patient gave him unique insights that would be invaluable in training others. More than that, his decision to return to the profession that had nearly cost him his life demonstrated the kind of commitment that defined the best military medical personnel. Colonel Elena Rodriguez walked through the halls of the military's premier medical facility, her responsibilities now extending far beyond individual patient care to shaping policy for the entire military medical system. As the Director of Combat Medical Innovation, she oversaw research programs, training initiatives, and technology development that would protect the next generation of warriors. But today's visit was personal. Martinez had been admitted for surgery to repair old injuries from his combat wounds complications that had developed years after his initial recovery. Elena had flown in from her headquarters to be present for the procedure, maintaining connections with the Marines whose lives had intersected with hers during that pivotal night in Afghanistan. "Doc, you didn't have to come," Martinez said as Elena entered his hospital room. He was 31 now, married to a nurse he'd met at UCLA, father to twin daughters who carried their father's determined spirit. "It's just routine surgery, nothing like what you did for me back then." Elena smiled, settling into the chair beside his bed. "There's no such thing as routine surgery when it's someone I care about. Besides, I wanted to meet these daughters I've heard so much about." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martinez's family, his wife Carmen, a trauma nurse who had become one of Elena's closest friends, and the twins, 8-year-old Sofia and Isabella, who had inherited their father's curiosity and their mother's compassion. The girls had heard stories about Tia Elena their entire lives, understanding her as the person who had saved their father's life before they were born, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Are you really the medic who performed surgery in a war zone?" Sofia asked with the directness that only children could achieve. "Papa says you saved him when all the doctors said it was impossible." Elena knelt to the girl's level, seeing Martinez's eyes and Carmen's smile in her young face. "Your papa was very brave that night. He helped me take care of other wounded Marines, even though he was hurt himself. That's the kind of courage that runs in your family." The interaction reminded Elena of why her work mattered beyond military applications. Every life saved in combat had ripple effects that extended through generations. Children who would grow up with fathers, families that remained whole, communities that benefited from the continued presence of those who had served. Her decisions during one terrible night in Afghanistan had preserved not just individual lives, but entire family legacies. Brigadier General Elena Rodriguez stood before a gathering of international military medical personnel, representing countries from around the world who had come to study American innovations in combat medicine. The techniques she had pioneered had been adopted by NATO allies, refined through research and testing, incorporated into medical protocols that had saved thousands of lives across multiple conflicts. The most important lesson we've learned, Elena told the assembled officers, is that medical innovation often comes from the field rather than the laboratory. The medics, corpsmen, and paramedics who work under fire develop solutions that no amount of peacetime training can anticipate. Our job as leaders is to create systems that support their initiative rather than constrain it. The audience included many who had implemented Rodriguez protocols in their own military medical systems, aggressive intervention standards that authorized field medics to exceed traditional scope of practice when lives were at stake. The techniques had been tested in conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, consistently producing better outcomes than conventional approaches. But Elena's greatest pride came from the young medics who approached her after the presentation, sharing stories of lives they had saved using techniques she had pioneered. A British paramedic described pulling survivors from a bombed building in Syria, performing field surgery that preserved limbs that would have been lost under standard protocols. A Canadian medic told of treating casualties from an IED blast in Mali, using improvised techniques to stabilize patients until proper surgical facilities were available. Each story reinforced Elena's belief that military medicine was fundamentally about empowering individual medical personnel to make extraordinary decisions under impossible circumstances. Regulations and protocols were important, but they could never replace the judgment and courage of medics who refused to accept the unacceptable. That evening, Elena found herself in the Quantico Officers Club, sharing drinks with Peterson, now a sergeant major who served as her senior enlisted advisor. Their conversation drifted to the Marines they had served with during that pivotal deployment, tracking the life paths that had diverged from their shared experience in Afghanistan. "You know what I think about sometimes," Peterson said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in combat zones. "What if you had followed orders that night? What if you had stayed in the bunker and let those Marines die?" Elena considered the question that had haunted her for years. Then 3 families would have been destroyed, and we would never have learned that individual medics could achieve what we thought required full surgical teams. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from someone being willing to risk everything on an impossible gamble. Peterson nodded, understanding the broader implications. "And now thousands of Marines are alive because you were willing to take that risk. Because you proved that one person could make a difference when it really mattered." Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now serving as Dean of Emergency Medicine, stood in the trauma bay where she trained civilian medical students, many of them veterans who brought military medical experience to civilian healthcare. The principles she had developed under fire had proven equally applicable to emergency medicine, disaster response, and mass casualty situations. Her current student was a young resident named David Williams, son of the Marine she had treated for head trauma 15 years earlier. David had grown up hearing stories about the medic who had saved his father's life, inspiring him to pursue medicine with a focus on trauma surgery. His father's recovery had been so complete that only careful examination revealed any evidence of his injuries. "Dr. Rodriguez, how do you know when to abandon standard protocols?" David asked during a particularly challenging trauma case. "When do you decide that the situation requires extraordinary measures?" Elena smiled, recognizing his father's determination in the young man's eyes. "When following the rules means accepting an outcome you can't live with. When you realize that being wrong while trying to save a life is better than being right while letting someone die." The conversation took place over the treatment of a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding, suffering injuries remarkably similar to those Elena had treated in combat zones. But this time she worked with a full surgical team, state-of-the-art equipment, and all the resources that had been unavailable during that terrible night in Afghanistan. As Elena guided David through the complex surgery required to save the patient, She reflected on how her approach to medicine had been shaped by learning to work with nothing but determination and improvised equipment. The abundance of resources available in civilian practice sometimes seemed overwhelming compared to the stark simplicity of combat medicine, where success depended entirely on skill, judgment, and the willingness to attempt the impossible. The most important thing I learned in the military, Elena told David as they completed the successful surgery, is that medicine is fundamentally about refusing to give up on people. Everything else, the equipment, the protocols, the formal training, is just tools to support that commitment. David nodded, understanding that he was receiving more than medical education. He was being initiated into a tradition of healers who chose to run toward danger when others ran away, who measured success not by career advancement, but by lives saved and families preserved. Elena sat before the House Armed Services Committee, now serving as the Department of Defense's senior advisor on military medical policy. Her testimony focused on proposed changes to military medical training that would formalize many of the innovations she had pioneered 2 decades earlier in a motor pool in Afghanistan. The fundamental question, Elena told the assembled congressmen and women, is whether we trust our medical personnel to make life and death decisions under extreme circumstances, or whether we constrain them with regulations that prioritize institutional liability over patient outcomes. The hearing was being broadcast live, watched by military medical personnel around the world who understood that Elena's recommendations would shape how future medics were trained and equipped. Her influence extended far beyond policy documents to the culture of military medicine itself, inspiring a generation of medical personnel who understood that their primary obligation was to their patients rather than their superiors. Representative Maria Gonzalez, now the committee chairwoman, asked the question that had driven Elena's entire career. General Rodriguez, what would you say to a young medic facing the same situation you encountered in Afghanistan? What guidance would you give someone who must choose between following orders and saving lives? Elena considered her response carefully, understanding that her words would be quoted in training centers and barracks for decades to come. I would tell them that they became medics to save lives, not to follow rules. That their obligation is to their patients first, their profession second, and the bureaucracy a distant third. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is prove that the impossible is just another word for something nobody has tried yet. The hearing concluded with unanimous approval of Elena's recommendations, but her real victory was measured in the emails and messages she received from medics around the world. Young corpsmen wrote to thank her for creating training programs that prepared them for situations their predecessors had faced unprepared. Veteran medics shared stories of lives saved using techniques she had pioneered. Families expressed gratitude for policies that had brought their loved ones home alive. General Elena Rodriguez stood on the parade ground at Marine Corps Base Quantico, surrounded by 3 generations of Marines whose lives had been touched by her service. The ceremony marking her retirement was attended by hundreds of medical personnel who had trained under her programs, served under her command, or simply been inspired by her example. Among the attendees were Martinez, Anderson, and Williams, now in their 50s, successful in their chosen careers, surrounded by children and grandchildren who existed because Elena had refused to accept their deaths as inevitable. Their presence served as living testimony to the impact that one person's courage could have across decades and generations. Martinez, now the chief nursing officer at UCLA Medical Center, spoke on behalf of all the lives Elena had saved. 25 years ago, a young medic decided that following orders was less important than saving lives. That decision didn't just preserve our lives, it changed how the military thinks about medicine, how we train medics, how we prepare for the impossible situations that define combat medicine. The ceremony included the unveiling of a memorial dedicated to all military medical personnel who had died in service, with Elena's name prominently featured among those who had shaped the profession. But she understood that her real memorial was the living legacy of medics who continued to push beyond conventional limitations. When lives were at stake. As Elena walked away from her final military ceremony, she carried with her the knowledge that she had accomplished something rare in military service. She had fundamentally changed how an entire profession approached its core mission. The scared young medic who had arrived in Afghanistan 25 years earlier had evolved into a leader whose influence would extend long after her own service ended. Elena Rodriguez, now 73 and serving as a volunteer at a veterans hospital, found herself mentoring a new generation of combat veterans who were transitioning to civilian medical careers. Many of them had been trained using protocols she had developed, had served in units that bore her influence, had internalized lessons that originated in a motor pool in Afghanistan decades earlier. Her latest mentee was a young Navy corpsman named Jackson Torres, grandson of the hospitalman she had trained years earlier, who was struggling to adapt civilian medical protocols to situations that required the aggressive intervention he had learned in combat zones. The hardest part, Jackson confided, is working in a system that prioritizes liability over outcomes. In the military, we were taught that saving lives was worth any risk. Here, they're more worried about lawsuits than patients. Elena smiled, recognizing the eternal tension between institutional caution and medical necessity. The principles don't change, she told him. You still have an obligation to do everything possible for your patients. You just have to be smarter about how you advocate for aggressive care within civilian systems. Their conversation was interrupted by a news report playing on the hospital television coverage of a mass casualty event where military-trained medics were being credited with saving lives through rapid, aggressive intervention that exceeded civilian protocols. Elena recognized the techniques being described, innovations that had originated during her service and spread throughout both military and civilian emergency medicine. "Ma'am," Jackson asked, "do you ever regret the choices you made? The risks you took, the rules you broke?" Elena considered the question while watching footage of survivors being reunited with their families, understanding that each reunion represented the culmination of countless individual decisions by medics who had chosen courage over caution. "I regret the Marines we couldn't save," she said finally. "I regret every life lost because we lacked the skills or equipment or courage to do more. But I've never regretted trying to do the impossible when someone's life was at stake." That's who we are as medical professionals, people who refuse to accept that someone has to die just because the situation seems hopeless. As Elena prepared to leave the hospital that evening, she passed the emergency department where young doctors and nurses were treating a steady stream of patients with efficiency and compassion that would have made her proud. Many of them had been trained using protocols she had developed, inspired by examples she had set, guided by principles she had fought to establish. The quiet satisfaction Elena felt wasn't about personal recognition or professional achievement. It was about the knowledge that she had helped create a culture where medical personnel were empowered to push beyond conventional limitations when lives were at stake. Every successful resuscitation, every innovative procedure, every decision to attempt the impossible was part of a legacy that extended far beyond any individual career. Standing in the parking lot of the Veterans Hospital, Elena looked up at the stars and thought about all the Marines who hadn't made it home, all the families that had been shattered by loss, all the battles that had been fought in operating rooms and aid stations around the world. But she also thought about the lives that had been saved, the families that had remained whole, the young medics who continued to carry forward the tradition of never accepting the unacceptable, the scared young woman who had arrived in Afghanistan 30 years earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that medicine at its best was an active rebellion against death itself. Elena Rodriguez had spent her career proving that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to accept that someone had to die. As she drove home through the quiet Virginia countryside, Elena carried with her the knowledge that her story was part of a larger narrative, a tradition of healers who had chosen service over safety, who had run toward danger when others ran away, who had proven again and again that love expressed through medical skill could triumph over the worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. The legacy would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by young medics who understood that saving lives was worth any personal cost, that medical personnel had an obligation to push beyond conventional limitations when human life was at stake. Elena Rodriguez had lived to see her most important lesson become the foundation of modern military medicine. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is prove that the impossible is just another word for something nobody has tried yet.